14th Amendment, approved by Congress in 1866 and ratified by 3/4 of the states in 1868, is the longest amendment ever added to the Constitution, and certainly one of the most important, probably the most significant since the original Bill of Rights. I think the best way to understand the 14th Amendment is to see it as the attempt by the victorious North, particularly the Republican Party, to put into the Constitution their understanding of the consequences of the Civil War, the meaning of the abolition of slavery and the preservation of the Union. How do those two great events play out in constitutional terms? And the 14th Amendment, which is 5 sections long, tries to deal with these consequences of the Civil War. Slavery, of course, had been abolished in the 13th Amendment, and the first section of the 14th Amendment, you might say, is trying to work out what it means, basically, to be a free person in the United States. And the first section of the 14th Amendment declares, first of all, that anybody born in the United States is a citizen of the United States. This made black people citizens. The Supreme Court of the United States, in the Dred Scott decision before the Civil War, had stated that citizenship was only for white Americans, that no black person could be a citizen of the country. Now, a national standard of citizenship is established in the 14th Amendment. Birthright citizenship, we call it. Then it goes on to say, well, these citizens are all to enjoy the equal protection of the law and the privileges and immunities of citizenship. Now, these are, of course, vague phrases. The meaning of them is worked out over time in laws and Supreme Court decisions. But the basic principle is equality before the law, to try to separate being an American from the tyranny of race. Now the African American former slaves are going to be integrated into the legal system as equal members of society with the same basic rights as white Americans. That's a new principle. It's put into the Constitution. It applies to everybody, not just black and white. It applies to Asian people. It applies to immigrants from Europe. It creates the first standard of citizenship in the United States and makes the Constitution, for the first time, a document to which people can appeal if they feel their equal rights are not being respected by the state governments. It says the states can no longer discriminate among citizens in their rights. But then there's plenty of other sections in the 14th Amendment, many of them forgotten today, but quite important at the time. The second section tries to encourage the southern states to give black men the right to vote. It leaves the voting requirements in the hands of the states, but it says that if they don't give black men the right to vote, they will lose some of their representation in Congress. It has nothing to do with women's voting. If you deprive women of the right to vote, as every state did at that time, you don't lose anything. And many of the early feminists at that time were quite annoyed at the Congress for introducing this gender distinction into the 14th Amendment. Then the amendment goes on in the third section to talk about who will hold office in the South, or that is to say, it bars from holding office leaders of the Confederacy. It's worded in a rather convoluted way, but basically they're trying to make sure that the governments that exist in the South, Andrew Johnson, the president who succeeded Lincoln, had created all white governments in the South, but many of the officials were ex-Confederates, and the Congress wanted to create loyal governments from their point of view who accepted the victory of the North in the Civil War and would implement the principle of equality that the amendment puts into the Constitution. And finally, there are other things which are sort of irrelevant today. It says there cannot be any monetary compensation for the loss of slaves. The Confederate debt is voided. Nobody is going to get money back who loaned money to the Confederacy and bought bonds. But the national debt, the money borrowed to pursue the war, can never be questioned, it says. And then the fifth section says that Congress will have the power to enforce the amendment with appropriate legislation. In other words, it really alters the federal system. It gives Congress power over the states to oversee the states and make sure that they are abiding by these basic principles of equality and citizenship put into the 14th Amendment. So taken together, the amendment really changes the Constitution. It makes it something that protects the rights now of individual citizens, not only against violation by the federal government, which the Bill of Rights had done, but against violations by the state governments. And the states before the war had all discriminated in some way or another on the basis of race. And of course, it was state law that had established slavery in the first place. So the 14th Amendment makes the Constitution what it has become in our own time, a vehicle for expanding equality and expanding the rights of all Americans, and particularly groups, whether they are on the basis of race, gender, sexual orientation, who have been deprived of equality throughout much of our history. So that is, in a nutshell, the significance of the most important amendment ever added to our Constitution since the Bill of Rights.